even though we're treated as an education space, there's a huge diversity of how our organisations deliver and how our planning and so forth are going. I realise we're all on a different point in that journey, and none of us will be the same, even though education's the same and education's different for everybody. So to give some, apart from the slide that's on the screen, I'll give some context to so you can understand why it was such a huge transformation for our college. So prior to 2020, creation of our exam papers involved teams of people emailing Word documents around. Once those documents have been finalised and answer books, we would print every single paper for every candidate. These were de-identified by affixing barcodes to them so that the markers weren't aware of the candidates' names. Then the documents were shipped to a central location in Queensland. All candidates were required to travel to Queensland for their examinations. This is 400 to 500 people. 150 examiners were also required to travel to Queensland. So basically then, you can imagine the logistics to all of that. But post-examination, then we had all these handwritten papers. So all of those were shipped to a commercial scanning provider, turned into PDFs, and if you, I'm sure you've all experienced different people's handwriting, so just the fact that it's been scanned and is now digital, especially if it's around medical or complex words and so forth, it can be very, very difficult from a scan. So they were all turned into PDFs. We then downloaded them from the scanning provider to a bespoke marking package so that the markers could finally log on and mark the papers. Now, weeks could go by after a candidate had sat an exam before it could even be marked. And there would be, it was very hard to have any tracking or any idea of where everything was at. And you can understand from that there were limitations to how we could mark. Vertical and horizontal marking and some of those other schemes were just not part of the equation at all. So that's prior 2020. I started at the college in March of 2020, 2 weeks before COVID hit, and all the manual processes and local file storage were useless. For the first time in 50 years, I cancelled the examinations and Science Week. So I can tell you, I'm in my third week, my KPIs were not looking great at all for being the new CEO. Microsoft 365 Education came to the rescue, and in 2 weeks, we had all the staff working from home and all digital files on SharePoint. Now, this wasn't the prettiest file migration to the cloud, I can assure you, but it was extremely effective, and we continue to work in that exact same tenant that brought us from having to work on-premise to the cloud. Mm-hmm. The college had a long-standing project to look at digital processes, but there was no real timeline, and that they had been working with vendors for over 3 years, and to be honest, the requirements were still very fluid across a lot of different stakeholders. The vendors were saying, just let us know what you want, we can customize it. The college saying, well, here is how we've done it manually since the 1970s. Just make it do that. That'd be good, because then everybody will know if you can just put that on the screen. As we know, that's just a recipe for disaster, but it continued on for quite a period of time. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that were invested in this multi-year endeavour that really had not provided any substantial deliverables to the college, and obviously resources right down to people and money are critical across our educational institutions. So basically I halted this project, and with COVID in full swing, with no examinations, we had the trigger to find platforms that were built on modern architecture and were focused on a cloud-first delivery premise as the basic tenet of development. Now, that was a big call for a college who, to be honest, it was if it's not broke, don't fix it type environment. And because everything had been done by paper, when I started at the college, someone described the timeline for things to be changed at the college as more of a geological timeline. to identify how slow things moved. It moved as slow as rocks and erosion. So to be honest, the COVID trigger, and for us, for the first time in 50 years, not delivering exams, was the perfect trigger to say, okay, now, and we're in the middle of COVID, and they're looking down the track of what will this look like over a number of years. Look at all the failings that we've had now. How do we move this forward, and what does it actually look like? So I'm sure from attending this, you understand that I won't go through all the details, but Microsoft and MaivenPoint were selected as the vendors to transform our college, taking us from the 70s to a modern digital platform. Covering off some of the pieces on the slide, I also wanted to cover off that there are some indirect pieces that don't commonly come across, which obviously IT departments will be very keen to investigate. But secure single sign-on for all stakeholders across all platforms, and if we want to harden it as hard as we want to harden that security, depending on what your governance and so forth is, you can. So that single sign-on was extremely important to us, having a single username and password for everything that the whether the examiner was logging on to a Teams session to be able to develop exams, or whether it was a candidate logging into MaivenPoint Examena to sit an exam. They only ever use that one username and password. And apart from what it meant from a security perspective, from a user's perspective, although we're an education institution, we know this isn't the most common username and password they're going to use in their lives. So it's not like, oh, we need to give them a password for this and a password for that, and they'll just have to cope. So it was very important for us to streamline as much as we can. We knew we were making major changes to our examination process. The other thing that quite often gets asked, or it might be in your selection criteria, is that where is the data held? Who's got my data? And if something happens, what happens with it? All our data exists on our Azure Microsoft tenant. So we always have access to all our examination data, all the recordings, all the remote proctoring and so forth, always stays with us. One of the really great points is that we have access to that data at any point in time, and it's under where we decide to store it. Obviously, we have it geolocated on Azure, but it's very simple to set those types of things up from that perspective. And we were talking about personalization before. One of the things with the Examiner platform is that from the moment you add your candidates in there, they have their own personal profile, they have their own personal portal. When they log in to do an exam, it greets them by their name and only shows them their exam, what they need to do, what their marks are, and so forth. It doesn't seem like a big deal when you're reading it as just a feature, but a lot of these exams for us are very high stakes exams, and it's very important for us to make sure that we've isolated what the information that the people are being given, and that they are presented with a professional modern interface to be able to, number one, do their exams, and number two, be able to get their results and so forth. So we're probably a lot different to a number of different colleges and universities. As you can see from the screen, I've called them 28 departments, but they're chapters from surgery to sports medicine, 400 to 500 people sitting exams annually. I've put in their local and international delivery. Probably about 10 to 15% of our candidates each year are international. So one of the things this has now allowed us to, and remember one of the things I said before was people had to fly to Queensland. So that person in Singapore needed to fly to Queensland, even if they were just coming for their 4-hour exam and to fly back. There wasn't an option. That's what they did. The only option that we did have was we had a big cohort in the UK, and we would send people to the UK at great expense to deliver examinations there. So now, for example, this year, we've got a single candidate in the Cayman Islands. First time we've had a candidate from the Cayman Islands, but they will sit on that platform stack of the Microsoft and MaivenPoint platform stack and be able to do their examination from there without that travel, and still get exactly the same experience that someone sitting locally here on New Zealand. The one thing that I think is quite important, I'm sure we've all had experience with IT companies, great ones that will give you anything you need in blueprints. I'm not underestimating what it takes to change your infrastructure. But what I can tell you is when you change it, with these platforms, it is quick. And there's no exaggeration. It was probably more like 2.5 months and then 3 months worth of doing a bit more UAT, but it was 3 months to full production. So we went to production ready and starting to input examinations on that Microsoft and MavenPoint stack, ready for exams for that year. Now, that's easy to say, and someone might be asking, okay, so we know when a system first goes in, what were your teething problems? Did we have some teething problems? We probably could have. We ran a lot of familiarization sessions because we were going from paper to digital. So we ran, because there's the ability to go in and do sample exams and all that for all the candidates. I can tell you that, and I'm sure everyone from that university background understands that the appeal process and so forth, and if there's especially if there's a piece of software or equipment, it's always grounds for an appeal. I can tell you 100% we had 0 appeals or 0 responses about anything to do with the online examination platform itself or the login and so forth. So that was 100% worked. And I know it's one of those things that things don't just work out of the box. Get them to do a sample or a test or whatever, it works out of the box. The remote proctoring, I mean, a lot of the examination platforms will tell you that there is remote proctoring, and there is, and for a lot of them they institute a third party and so forth. The remote proctoring, as it works inside the MavenPoint stack, allows us to do our digital ID. So we do the ID, and then we can set it for just active monitoring and alerting. It doesn't necessarily have to stop the exam, but it does. If someone looks away from their screen for more than X amount of seconds that you decide is a trigger point, it'll send an alert to whoever's monitoring the exams to say, hey, have a look at this video, and it will show them the last X amount of minutes of video and so forth. Even if we just at the moment just record it for the sake that if there is any issues, we can go back and look at the recording and do an assessment. But we have the alerts just in case something happens to somebody, and we can ask them if they are okay or they've lost their video or whatever it is. So the remote proctoring works extremely well and is fully integrated into the solution. There's not all these other hoops to jump through when you do it. I've said about the candidate ID checks. The other piece is, as soon as you start talking about online, there's that other big step of saying, okay, so it's now online and it's now decentralized. So how are you getting all the hardware to these people to do their exams? And that was a big question. But we do everything BYOD, and I know that's been around for a long time, but having a platform that does Mac, PC, and is a bring your own device where people go through and do their examination. It's not just that it's a bring your own device. The way the client actually works is that the client can go offline. You can lose the internet and everything on that machine they will still be able to do the exam, and everything's encrypted on that local machine. So it's not like, oh, then they disconnect and someone can extract the information. It's all encrypted, and as soon as it connects back to the internet, it talks back to the server and normal software as a service. So it's not just bring your own device. It actually looks at that platform from the moment the candidate logs on all the way through to issues with the internet. If they had to log back on later, it will always update. The client is quite thin, and it installs very quickly. There's not a lot of bandwidth required across those clients, which when you start putting, like for some locations where we've had 60 and 70 clients in one particular area all sharing that bandwidth, getting enough bandwidth used to be a problem, whereas that isn't anymore. The one thing, there's always the examination piece of delivering the examination, but for us, a lot of our, because we deliver advanced certifications for veterinarians, they have to actually be vets for 3.5 years before they can even sit an exam, and then they're sitting in an advanced area of an advanced discipline, which might be ophthalmology or dermatology. So we don't have a faculty of all those experts. All those experts are professionals, whether they're from academic universities like yours or whether they're in practice and so forth. There is 150 subject experts that have to create and deliver and mark examinations remotely. They're not sitting, a lot of them aren't sitting in academic institutions. They are doing this spread all over Australia and New Zealand, which is where our primary a lot of stakeholders is. So it's not just it's not the examination platform as a delivery point, it's as a creation point. We create, we mark, we put all the different types of questions and so forth. You're right down to sub-questions, zooming on information. They can insert tables and so forth. I guess the implementation outcome, which is on this slide, is that we did digitalize the entire examination process. It really had a huge effect on administration, but for every stakeholder, there was an effect that was a positive effect for them. Did everybody like being told that they needed another login from university for another Office 365 account? You know, that still can be a bit of a trick for people switching between things. But what I wanted to make sure that people understood from the stack is that you're creating, delivery, grading, and distributing the results. So after all of that's done, it's all in the one platform. And at the end of it, when you decide to release the results, the candidates log into exactly the same portal that they logged into that personal profile to be delivered their results. And it's all sitting in that same stack. When I put this together, it's hard to not see clickbait that we implemented this thing and it was 100-fold improvement, that it seems like, oh yeah, I've seen that on every YouTube video. But if you understand the context of where we came from and the amount of stakeholders involved, it's very conservative of our 100-fold benefit and advantages that we've had from implementing this stack.